The dust kicked up from the main street of Copper Creek as another scorching afternoon settled over the small frontier town. Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her brow as she stepped out of the general store, her arms full of supplies for the ranch. The wooden sidewalks creaked under the boots of cowboys and townspeople going about their daily business, but there was a tension in the air that made everyone move a little faster than usual. 3 weeks had passed since the Garrett gang had first appeared in their territory. Led by the ruthless Marcus Garrett, they had been systematically terrorizing small ranches and settlements throughout the valley. Just yesterday, they had burned down the Henderson place, leaving old Tom Henderson and his family with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The local sheriff, a man named Bill Crawford, was doing his best, but everyone knew he was outgunned and outnumbered. Sarah adjusted her grip on the heavy sack of flour and started walking toward her horse when she noticed him. A lone figure sat on a weathered brown horse at the edge of town, watching the street with quiet eyes. He was not a large man, certainly not imposing like the cowboys who worked the bigger spreads. His clothes were simple and worn a faded blue shirt and leather vest that had seen better days. His hat was pulled low over his face, but she could see he was young, maybe in his late 20s. What struck her most was how still he sat. While other riders would shift in their saddles, adjust their reins, or let their horses move restlessly, this man and his mount were like a statue. There was something almost peaceful about him, as if he carried a calm that extended to everything around him. "Ma'am, you need help with those supplies?" Sarah turned to find Jake Morrison, one of the ranch hands from the Bartee spread, tipping his hat to her. Jake was a good man, honest and hardworking, but like most of the cowboys in the area, he was getting nervous about the growing threat of the Garrett gang. "Thank you, Jake, but I can manage," Sarah replied, securing the supplies to her horse. "Any word from the sheriff about those outlaws?" Jake's expression darkened. "Nothing good. Word is they hit the Taylor Ranch last night, took their horses and what little money they had saved. Taylor tried to stand up to them." Jake paused, his voice dropping. "They beat him pretty bad. Doc says he'll live, but it'll be a while before he's back on his feet." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. The Taylor Ranch was only 5 miles from her family's place. The Garrett gang was getting bolder, coming closer town, and there seemed to be no one who could stop them. "Sheriff Crawford putting together a posse?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Tried to," Jake said, spitting into the dust. "Most folks are too scared. Can't say I blame them. Garrett's got at least 12 men riding with him, all of them mean as rattlesnakes. Crawford's brave enough, but he's just one man with a badge. What's he going to do against that many guns?" As if summoned by their conversation, Sheriff Crawford emerged from his office across the street. He was a tall, lean man in his 50s with graying hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years dealing with trouble. His badge caught the sunlight as he walked toward them, but Sarah could see the weight of responsibility pulling at his shoulders. "Sarah, Jake," he nodded as he approached. "I suppose you heard about the Taylors." "We did," Sarah replied. "Sheriff, what are we going to do? They're getting closer to town every day." Crawford removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. "I've sent word to the territorial marshal, but it'll be at least a week before he can get here with men. Maybe longer." He looked around the street, taking in the nervous faces of the townspeople. "I'm not going to lie to you folks. We're in a tight spot." It was then that the quiet stranger rode slowly down the main street. His horse moved at an easy walk, and he kept his eyes forward, not looking at the people who had stopped to watch him pass. There was something about his presence that made conversations fade to whispers. "Who's that?" Jake asked, his hand unconsciously moving toward the gun on his hip. "Never seen him before," Crawford replied, but his tone was cautious rather than alarmed. "Doesn't look like trouble, though." The stranger rode past them without acknowledgement and stopped in front of the Lucky Dollar Saloon. He dismounted with fluid grace, tied his horse to the hitching post, and walked through the batwing doors. The entire exchange took less than a minute, but somehow it felt significant. "Something different about that one," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to the others. Inside the Lucky Dollar, the stranger approached the bar, where Pete Donnelly was wiping down glasses with a stained rag. The saloon was nearly empty, except for a few local cowboys nursing beers and playing cards in the corner. The stranger's spurs jingled softly as he walked, the only sound in the suddenly quiet room. "What'll it be?" Pete asked, setting down a clean glass. "Water, please," the stranger replied. His voice was soft, almost gentle, with no trace of the swagger that most gunfighters carried. Pete raised an eyebrow, but poured the water without comment. "You're not from around here." "No," the stranger agreed, taking a slow sip. "Just passing through." "Might want to pass through a little faster," one of the card players called out. "This ain't exactly the safest territory right now." The stranger turned slightly toward the speaker, a cowboy named Red Hawkins who worked for one of the larger ranches. "Trouble?" Red laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You could say that. Got ourselves a gang of outlaws making life miserable for everyone within 50 miles. Got it gong. You heard of them?" "I have," the stranger said quietly. "Well, unless you're looking to get yourself killed, I'd suggest you water your horse and ride on," Red continued. "These boys don't take kindly to strangers, and they sure don't leave witnesses." The stranger finished his water and placed a coin on the bar. "Thank you for the warning." As he turned to leave, Red called after him. "Hey, friend, you got a name?" The stranger paused at the doors. "John," he said simply, and walked back into the sunlight. Outside, Sheriff Crawford was still talking with Sarah and Jake when John emerged from the saloon. The sheriff noticed him immediately and walked over, his instincts as a lawman making him curious about any newcomer during such troubled times. "Afternoon," Crawford said, extending his hand. "Sheriff Bill Crawford." John shook his hand with a firm grip. "John." "John what?" "Just John." Crawford studied the man's face, noting the calm in his dark eyes and the way he carried himself. "You planning to stay in Copper Creek long?" "Depends," John replied. "On what?" John looked down the street toward the edge of town, where dust clouds suggested approaching riders. "On whether I'm needed." Crawford followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. Even from a distance, he could count at least 8 riders approaching fast. In a town already on edge, a group that size could only mean one thing. "That would be them," Jake said grimly, his hand moving to his gun. "Everyone stay calm," Crawford ordered, but his own hand was already resting on his weapon. The riders thundered into town, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces hard with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they were the biggest threat for miles around. Marcus Garrett rode at the front, a big man with cold blue eyes and a scar running down his left cheek. His black hat was pulled low, and his hand rested casually on his gun, as if drawing it was as natural as breathing. Behind him rode his gang, a collection of hard men who had chosen the outlaw life because it suited their nature. They were the kind of men who took what they wanted and killed anyone who stood in their way. Their reputation was well-earned, and their presence in Copper Creek sent a chill through everyone watching. Garrett pulled his horse to a stop in front of the sheriff's office and looked around the street with the air of a man surveying his domain. His eyes passed over Crawford, Sarah, Jake, and, finally, settled on John, who had not moved or changed expression despite the arrival of the gang. Well, Garrett said, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. "Looks like Little Copper Creek has itself a new face." He dismounted slowly, making a show of adjusting his gun belt as his men spread out behind him. The message was clear. They own this street, and everyone on it. "Sheriff Crawford," Garrett said with mock politeness, "I trust you've been keeping the peace in my absence." "This is my town, Garrett," Crawford replied, stepping forward despite being clearly outnumbered. "And you're not welcome here." Garrett laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your town?" "Sheriff, I think you're confused about who's in charge here." He gestured to his men. "I've got the guns to prove otherwise." "We've got law here," Crawford insisted, though everyone could hear the strain in his voice. "Law?" Garrett looked around at the nervous faces of the townspeople. "I don't see any law. I see one old man with a badge and a bunch of scared sheep." It was then that John stepped forward. He moved with the same quiet calm he had shown since arriving, but something about his posture had changed. There was a readiness there, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. "Maybe you should move on," John said quietly. The street went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Garrett turned his full attention to the stranger who had dared to speak up. "Excuse me," Garrett said, his hand moving closer to his gun. "I said maybe you should move on," John repeated, his voice still calm, but carrying something else now. Something that made Garrett's eyes narrow. "Mister, you must be new around here," Garrett said, stepping closer. "Let me explain how things work. I ride into town, I take what I want, and folks like you keep their mouths shut if they want to keep breathing." John didn't move, didn't blink, didn't show any sign of intimidation. "That's not how it's going to work today." Garrett's scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. Is that right? You think you can stand up to me, stranger? You, and what army? For the first time since arriving in town, John smiled. It was a small smile, but it changed his entire face. Where before he had seemed merely calm, now there was something else. Something dangerous. I don't need an army, John said quietly. What happened next would be talked about in Copper Creek for years to come. Garrett went for his gun, and he was fast. Faster than most men who had lived to tell about it. His hand moved like lightning, clearing leather in one smooth motion that spoke of years of practice and deadly intent. But John was faster. His gun appeared in his hand as if by magic, and the sharp crack of gunfire echoed off the buildings lining the street. Garrett's gun flew from his hand, and he stumbled backward, clutching his wrist and staring in shock at the stranger who had just outdrawn him. The gang members reached for their weapons, but John's voice stopped them cold. I wouldn't, he said, his gun now trained on the nearest outlaw. Your boss is alive because I chose to let him live. You might not be so lucky. Garrett stared at his empty holster, then at John, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally, fear. Who are you? John holstered his weapon with the same fluid grace he had drawn it. Someone who doesn't like bullies. This isn't over, Garrett snarled, holding his injured wrist against his chest. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Neither do you, John replied quietly. Garrett signaled to his men, and they mounted up, but not before he fixed John with a stare full of murderous promise. We'll be back, stranger, and next time, I'll bring enough men to bury this whole damn town. As the gang rode out of town, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake, the people of Copper Creek slowly emerged from doorways and hiding spots. They looked at John with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. He had just done something they had thought impossible, but they all knew Garrett's threat was real. He would be back, and when he came, it would be with overwhelming force. Sheriff Crawford approached John, his face showing respect but also concern. That was fine shooting, John, but Garrett wasn't bluffing. He'll come back with twice as many men, maybe more. I know, John replied, watching the dust cloud disappear over the horizon. Then, why did you do it? Sarah asked, stepping closer. You could have just ridden on through. John looked at her, and for a moment, his composed facade slipped slightly. There was pain in his eyes, old pain that had been carried for a long time. Because, he said quietly, sometimes a man has to make a stand, even when the odds are against him. As the sun began to set over Copper Creek, casting long shadows down the main street, John walked his horse to the livery stable. The townspeople watched him go, whispering among themselves about the stranger who had faced down the most dangerous man in the territory. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that John carried with him a history that would have shocked them to their core. Hidden in his saddlebags was a leather pouch containing items that spoke of alliances formed in desperate times and bonds forged in blood and honor. Inside that pouch were eagle feathers, each one representing a life saved or a debt owed. There was a beaded medicine bag, crafted by hands that had known him not as a stranger, but as a brother. And wrapped in soft deerskin was a war lance head, carved with symbols that told the story of a white man who had earned the respect and loyalty of Apache warriors. As John settled his horse for the night and found himself a room at the boarding house, he thought about the message he would need to send. The code was simple, passed down through generations of Apache warriors. A signal fire on the mesa north of town, burning with a specific pattern that would carry across the desert faster than any telegraph. The people of Copper Creek thought they had seen a lucky gunfighter face down a bully. They had no idea they had witnessed the first move in a game that would bring together forces Garrett could never have imagined. That night, as John sat on the porch of the boarding house and looked up at the stars, he began to plan. Garrett would indeed return, probably within a few days. He would bring more men, better guns, and a determination to make an example of the town that had dared to defy him. But Garrett had made one crucial mistake. He had threatened innocent people in front of a man who had learned from the Apache that family was everything, and that anyone who threatened family deserved no mercy. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, John pulled a small mirror from his pocket. It was polished silver, designed to catch and reflect light across great distances. Tomorrow, when the sun reached its peak, he would send a message that would travel across the desert to ears that were always listening. The message would be simple. Come, bring the others. It's time. In the distance, a coyote howled, and John smiled. He had learned long ago that the desert had eyes and ears, and that those who knew how to listen could hear messages carried on the wind. Marcus Garrett and his gang had picked the wrong town to terrorize. More importantly, they had threatened the wrong man. Soon, they would learn that some cowboys had allies they could never have imagined, and that the quiet stranger they had dismissed as weak was connected to 77 of the finest warriors the desert had ever known. The real story was just beginning. Dawn broke over Copper Creek with a stillness that felt different from the usual morning calm. Word of the previous day's confrontation had spread through town like wildfire, and now everyone moved with the careful tension of people waiting for the other shoe to drop. John had risen early, taking his coffee on the boarding house porch while watching the sun climb over the eastern mountains. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding housekeeper, approached him with fresh biscuits and a worried expression. She was a kind woman in her 60s who had seen enough frontier violence to know that yesterday's victory was likely to bring worse trouble today. "More coffee, Mr. John?" she asked, though her real purpose was clearly to gauge his intentions. "Thank you," John replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "These are fine biscuits, Mrs. Henderson. My grandmother's recipe," she said, then hesitated. "Mr. John, I don't mean to pry, but folks are wondering, are you planning to stay in town? Because if Garrett comes back like he promised..." John looked at her kindly. "What would you like me to do, Mrs. Henderson?" "That's not for me to say," she replied quickly. "It's just that you've got folks hoping, and hope can be a dangerous thing when it's misplaced." Before John could respond, young Tommy Peterson came running down the street, his bare feet kicking up dust as he headed straight for the boarding house. Tommy was only 12, but he was the fastest runner in town and often carried messages between the scattered ranches. "Mr. John," Tommy called out, breathless from his sprint. "Sheriff Crawford wants to see you right away. Says it's important." John finished his coffee and stood, placing a gentle hand on Mrs. Henderson's shoulder. "Hope isn't misplaced when it's backed by action," he told her quietly. "And I never abandon people who need help." The sheriff's office was already crowded when John arrived. Crawford was there, along with several local ranchers and townspeople, all wearing expressions of grim concern. Sarah Mitchell stood near the window, and John noticed she carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling trouble. "John, thank you for coming," Crawford said. "We got a problem." "Garrett's already making his move," said Frank Taylor, still showing bruises from his encounter with the gang a few days earlier. "My boy rode in this morning from the high country. He saw their camp." "Where?" John asked simply. "Devil's Canyon, about 15 miles north of here," Taylor continued. "According to my boy, Garrett's gathered at least 25 men. Maybe more. They're not just outlaws anymore, John. He's recruited gunfighters, drifters, anyone willing to kill for money." Sarah stepped forward from her position by the window. "There's more. They've been stealing horses and supplies from every ranch they've hit. They're not just planning to raid the town and move on. They're planning to take it over completely." Crawford nodded gravely. "I've seen this before in other territories. Garrett's trying to set himself up as a local warlord. He'll control every ranch, every business, every person. Anyone who opposes him dies." "What about the territorial marshal?" asked Doc Morrison, the town's physician. "Still 3 days out, minimum," Crawford replied. "Even if I could get word to him about Garrett's increased numbers, he'd be bringing maybe 6 or 8 men at most. Not nearly enough." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated their situation. They were facing an army of killers with nothing but a handful of ranch hands and an aging sheriff. Everyone looked at John, but he seemed lost in thought, staring out the window at something they couldn't see. "John," Crawford prompted. "When do you think they'll attack?" John asked. "My guess is tomorrow night, maybe the night after," Taylor said. "That would give them time to scout the town's defenses and plan their approach." John nodded slowly. "That gives us today and tomorrow." "To do what?" Sarah asked. "Even if every man in town was willing to fight, we're still outnumbered 3-1. And that's assuming the cowboys don't run when they see how many guns Garrett's bringing." John turned from the window and looked at each person in the room. "How well do you know the country north of here?" "Pretty well," Taylor replied. "Why?" "There's a mesa about 8 miles north, overlooks the whole valley. You can see for 50 miles in every direction from up there." "Eagle Mesa," Sarah said. "Indians used to use it as a lookout point." "What about it? I need to get up there today before sunset." Crawford frowned. "John, I appreciate what you did yesterday, but Scouting Garrett's position isn't going to change our situation. We need men and guns, not information. John was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a certainty that surprised everyone in the room. Sometimes the best way to even the odds is to call in old debts. What kind of debts? Sarah asked. Instead of answering directly, John asked a question of his own. How many of you know the history of this territory? The real history, not just what's written in the territorial records. Doc Morrison spoke up. I've been here longer than most, seeing the Apache wars, the treaties, the broken promises. Then, you know that not all the Apache left when the government said they did. John continued. Some stayed, hidden in the deep canyons and high places. They watch what happens in their ancestral lands. There's rumors, Taylor admitted reluctantly. Stories about Apache bands still living free in the wilderness areas. But they don't bother white folks anymore, long as we don't bother them. John smiled slightly. What if I told you that some of those Apache have reasons to trust certain white men? Reasons that go back years, built on mutual respect and shared dangers. The implications of his words hung in the air like smoke. Sarah was the first to understand. You're saying you have some kind of relationship with Apache warriors, she said slowly. I'm saying that Marcus Garrett is about to learn that threatening innocent people brings consequences he never imagined. Crawford leaned forward. John, are you telling us you can get Apache help? Because if you're giving folks false hope, I'm telling you that I need to get to Eagle Mesa before sunset, and I need to signal some friends, John replied. After that, we'll see what kind of help is willing to come. The room erupted in whispers and nervous exchanges. The idea of Apache warriors riding to help defend a white settlement was almost too fantastic to believe. Yet there was something in John's manner, a quiet confidence that suggested he wasn't making empty boasts. Even if you're right, Sarah said, how do we know they'll come? And how do we know they won't decide we're as much of a threat as Garrett's gang? John looked at her directly. Because I've stood with them when bullets were flying, and they've stood with me. Because some bonds go deeper than the color of a man's skin. And because Apache warriors understand the difference between those who threaten innocent people and those who protect them. An hour later, John was riding north toward Eagle Mesa, carrying supplies that would have puzzled anyone who saw them. Along with the usual provisions for a day's ride, his saddlebags contain a polished silver mirror, several pieces of colored cloth, and a small bundle wrapped in deerskin that he handled with particular care. The ride to Eagle Mesa took him through country that was both beautiful and dangerous. Red rock canyons gave way to pine-covered slopes, and hidden springs nourished patches of green in the otherwise desert landscape. John knew this country well, had learned its secrets during a time in his life that seemed like another world. As he climbed the winding trail to the mesa's summit, memories came flooding back. He remembered the first time he had made this climb, 5 years ago, when he was running from a different kind of trouble and had stumbled into an Apache camp by accident. Instead of killing him, the warriors had seen something in him worth saving. The mesa's flat top provided a commanding view of the entire valley. John could see Copper Creek far below, looking small and vulnerable from this height. To the north, he could just make out the dark smudge that marked Devil's Canyon, where Garrett was gathering his army of killers. John unpacked his supplies and began the careful work of building what would appear to casual observation as a simple campfire. But the placement of stones, the type of wood, and the timing of the flames would create a specific pattern of smoke signals that could be read by those who knew the code. As the sun reached its afternoon peak, John began his work with the mirror, catching the sunlight and flashing it in carefully timed sequences toward the distant peaks. Each flash was part of a message, a way of communicating across vast distances that had been used by Apache scouts for generations. The message was complex, containing information about the threat to Copper Creek, the number of enemies involved, and a request for the kind of help that could only come from warriors who owed him their lives. But underlying all the tactical details was a simpler message, one that needed no code to understand. Come, your brother needs you. As evening approached, John built his signal fire. He used specific woods that would burn with particular colors, creating a pattern of smoke that could be seen for miles. The fire would burn through the night, its message clear to anyone who understood its meaning. While he waited, John opened the deerskin bundle he had carried with him. Inside were objects that told the story of his connection to the Apache people. Eagle feathers given to him by Chief Gray Wolf after John had saved the chief's son from a mountain lion. A turquoise amulet crafted by the chief's daughter, who had become like a sister to him, and a small piece of obsidian carved with symbols that mark him as a blood brother to the Eagle clan. Each item represented a moment when John had chosen to help rather than harm, to understand rather than judge, to see the Apache as people rather than enemies. In return, he had been given something precious, a family among people who valued courage, honor, and loyalty above all else. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, John heard what he had been waiting for, the haunting call of a night hawk, repeated 3 times in the specific pattern that meant message received. The sound came from the canyon below, impossible to hear unless one knew exactly what to listen for. His message had been acknowledged. Now came the hardest part, waiting to see if his Apache brothers would risk everything to help defend a town full of white settlers. The answer came with the dawn. John woke to find 3 horses tied near his own, and 3 Apache warriors sitting silently around the remains of his signal fire. He recognized them immediately. Red Hawk, a scout and tracker without equal, Stone Bear, a warrior whose strength was legendary even among his own people, and most surprising of all, Morning Star, Chief Gray Wolf's daughter. "Brother," Red Hawk said in heavily accented English, rising to clasp John's hand. "We received your message." "I wasn't sure you would come," John replied in the Apache tongue, which he spoke fluently. Morning Star smiled, and John was reminded of why the young Apache woman had so impressed him with her intelligence and courage. "Did you think we would ignore a brother's call for help?" Stone Bear, a man of few words even by Apache standards, simply nodded and gestured toward the valley below. "Tell us about these enemies." John explained the situation in detail, describing Garrett's gang, their numbers, and their intentions toward Copper Creek. The 3 Apache listened in silence, occasionally asking questions about terrain, weapon numbers, and the fighting abilities of the townspeople. "The white people of this town," Morning Star asked, "they are worth fighting for?" It was a crucial question, John knew. The Apache had no reason to love white settlers, who had taken their lands and broken countless promises. If John couldn't convince them that the people of Copper Creek were different, his friends would ride away and leave the town to its fate. "They're good people," John said. "They work hard, they care for their families, and they don't seek trouble with anyone. Yesterday, when I faced the leader of these outlaws, they could have stayed hidden and safe. Instead, they stood with me." Red Hawk nodded thoughtfully. "And this outlaw leader, he threatens not just property, but lives?" "He threatens women and children," John replied. "He burns homes and beats old men. He is the kind of enemy our people have always fought against." The 3 Apache exchanged looks, and John could see them reaching a decision without needing to speak. Finally, Morning Star turned back to him. "Chief Gray Wolf remembers the debt we owe you," she said. "When you saved his son from the Great Cat, you became family. When you helped our people during the hungry winter, you became brother. Now you call on that brotherhood." "I do," John replied simply. Stone Bear stood and looked toward the distant peaks where the main Apache encampment lay hidden. "How many warriors do you need?" The question stunned John. He had hoped for a few scouts, maybe a handful of fighters. "How many can you bring?" Morning Star smiled, and for the first time since arriving, she showed the fierce joy that Apache warriors felt before battle. "Chief Gray Wolf has called in debts of his own. The Eagle clan, the Bear clan, and the Wolf clan have all answered. 77 warriors ride toward this valley. They will be here by tomorrow's sunset." John felt his breath catch. 77 Apache warriors was more than an army. It was a force that could reshape the entire balance of power in the territory. Garrett's gang of outlaws, no matter how well-armed, would be facing opponents who had been fighting in this desert for generations. "There is one condition," Red Hawk added. "The white people of your town must know we come as friends. If they shoot at us, we will defend ourselves." "I'll make sure they understand," John promised. As the sun climbed higher, the 4 of them rode down from Eagle Mesa toward Copper Creek. John knew that the next 24 hours would determine not just the fate of the town, but potentially the future of relations between white settlers and Apache peoples in the entire territory. Behind them, invisible to untrained eyes, signal fires began appearing on distant peaks. The message was spreading through the Apache network faster than any telegraph. The brother who had stood with them in dark times was calling for help, and the Eagle, Bear, and Wolf clans were riding to answer. Marcus Garrett had made a critical error. He had assumed that John was just another drifting cowboy with a fast gun. He had no idea that the quiet stranger was connected to a brotherhood of warriors who valued honor above life itself, and who had never forgotten a debt of loyalty. As they rode toward town, John began planning how to coordinate the defense of Copper Creek with forces that most white people had never even imagined. The real battle was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. The return to Copper Creek created a sensation unlike anything the frontier town had ever experienced. When John rode down the main street, accompanied by 3 Apache warriors, conversation stopped mid-sentence, and people emerged from buildings to stare in amazement. The sight of Apache and a white man riding together as equals was something most of these settlers had never seen, and many had been taught to believe was impossible. Sheriff Crawford stepped out of his office, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before John's calm demeanor made him reconsider. Sarah Mitchell, who had been sweeping the porch of her family store, let the broom fall from her hands as she took in a sight of the Apache warriors with their painted horses and traditional weapons alongside their modern rifles. "John," Crawford called out, his voice carefully controlled. "We need to talk." John dismounted and gestured for his 3 companions to do the same. Red Hawk, Stone Bear, and Morning Star moved with the fluid grace of people completely comfortable in their own skin, showing neither aggression nor deference as they faced the gathering crowd of white settlers. "Sheriff," John said, "I'd like you to meet some friends of mine. This is Red Hawk, Stone Bear, and Morning Star. They've come to help us with our garret problem." The silence that followed was so complete that even the usual sounds of the frontier town seemed muted. Finally, Doc Morrison pushed through the crowd, his medical training overriding his cultural prejudices as he studied the Apache warriors with professional interest. "They're here to fight with us?" he asked, his voice carrying equal parts hope and disbelief. Morning Star stepped forward, and John noted how her presence commanded respect even from people who had never seen an Apache woman before. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear, each word chosen for maximum impact. "Your town faces enemies," she said, looking directly at Crawford. "These enemies threaten innocent people. Among my people, this makes them our enemies as well. But why would you help us?" Sarah asked, her natural curiosity overcoming her surprise. "I mean, no disrespect, but our peoples haven't always been." She struggled for the right words. "At peace," Red Hawk finished for her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "This is true, but John has shown us that some white men understand honor. Some understand that protecting family and community matters more than the color of skin." Crawford removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture John was beginning to recognize as the sheriff's way of thinking through complex problems. "How many of your people are we talking about?" Stone Bear, who had remained silent until now, spoke in a voice like distant thunder. "Enough." The crowd began murmuring among themselves, a mix of excitement and nervousness rippling through the gathered townspeople. John could see that some, like Sarah and Doc Morrison, were intrigued by this unexpected alliance. Others, like the Cowboy Red Hawkins who had emerged from the saloon, looked skeptical and worried. "Now hold on just a minute," Red called out, pushing toward the front of the crowd. "We're supposed to trust our lives to a bunch of savages? How do we know they won't turn on us the minute the fighting starts?" The temperature of the gathering seemed to drop 10 degrees at Red's words. Stone Bear's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the war axe at his belt, while Red Hawk's eyes narrowed dangerously. But it was Morning Star who responded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You call us savages," she said, stepping close enough to Red that he had to look up to meet her eyes. "Yet it is your people who break treaties, who poison rivers, who kill buffalo for sport and leave them to rot. It is your people who make war on women and children." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Perhaps you should ask yourself who the real savages are." John stepped between them before the confrontation could escalate further. "Red, I understand your concerns, but these people have more honor in their little fingers than Marcus Garrett has in his whole body. They're here because they believe in protecting innocent lives, not because they have anything to gain. And how exactly do we know you're not leading us into some kind of trap?" Red demanded, his fear making him more aggressive. "Maybe this whole thing is Apache revenge, and you're helping them." The accusation hung in the air like poison, and John felt the careful balance he was trying to maintain beginning to slip. Before he could respond, however, An unexpected voice cut through the tension. Because I've seen him fight for us already. Everyone turned to see young Tommy Peterson pushing through the crowd, his face flushed with the earnest intensity that only 12-year-old boys can manage. Mr. John could have ridden away yesterday when Garrett threatened him. He could have minded his own business and let Garrett burn down our whole town. But he didn't. He stood up for us even though he didn't even know us. The boy looked around at the assembled adults, his young voice carrying a moral authority that shamed many of them. If Mr. John says these Apache people are here to help us, then that's good enough for me. And if you're too scared or too stupid to accept help when we need it, then maybe you deserve whatever Garrett does to you. Tommy, his mother called from the crowd, but there was pride in her voice along with the scolding. The boy's words seemed to break the spell of fear and suspicion that had gripped the crowd. Sarah stepped forward and extended her hand to Morningstar. I apologize for Red's words, she said. Not all of us share his opinions. If you're willing to risk your lives to help protect our town, then you're welcome here. Morningstar took her hand in a firm grip, and John saw understanding pass between the two women. We fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, Morningstar replied. This is the Apache way. Crawford cleared his throat, reasserting his authority as the town's lawman. All right, people, let's settle down and figure out what we're dealing with. John, can you and your friends come into the office so we can discuss this properly? As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with excitement and nervousness, John noticed Red Hawkins stalking away toward the saloon, his face dark with anger and fear. John made a mental note to keep an eye on him. Men like Red, when faced with challenges to their worldview, sometimes did dangerous and unpredictable things. Inside the sheriff's office, the atmosphere was tense but businesslike. Crawford had spread a rough map of the territory across his desk, and Red Hawk studied it with the intensity of a professional scout. Morningstar and Stone Bear positioned themselves where they could watch both the map and the door, their warriors' instincts never fully at rest. Now, Crawford began, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. John said you people could bring enough help to make a difference against Garrett's gang. How many fighters are we talking about? Red Hawk looked to John, who nodded encouragingly. 77 warriors of the Eagle, Bear, and Wolf clans, Red Hawk replied. They're experienced fighters, well-armed, and familiar with this territory. Crawford's eyes widened. 77? That's more than I dared hope for. It's more than enough to destroy Garrett's gang, Stone Bear added grimly. But the fighting must be done carefully. We cannot allow innocent townspeople to be caught between the two forces. Sarah, who had joined them in the office, leaned forward over the map. What kind of plan are we talking about? Morningstar traced her finger along the routes leading into town. Garrett will expect resistance from the town itself. He will not expect attack from the desert, from directions his scouts cannot watch. Assuming his scouts don't spot your warriors approaching, Crawford pointed out. Red Hawk smiled, and for the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely amused. Sheriff, Apache warriors can move through this country without being seen by anyone who is not Apache. We have been doing this since before your people came to this land. John spread his hands on the map, studying the terrain around Copper Creek. The key is coordination. Your warriors will need to know which buildings contain civilians and which contain Garrett's men. We'll need signals to coordinate the attack. When will they arrive? Sarah asked. Tomorrow evening, just before sunset, Morningstar replied. They will position themselves during the night and attack when the sun rises the following day. Crawford shook his head in amazement. I have to ask, why are your people willing to do this? 77 warriors is a significant force. Your chiefs must have strong reasons for committing so many fighters to help a white settlement. Morningstar and Red Hawk exchanged glances, and John could see them making a decision about how much of his history to reveal. Finally, Morningstar spoke. 5 winters ago, John saved the life of Chief Gray Wolfson during a hunting accident. But that was only the beginning. During the hungry winter that followed, when government promises proved empty and our people faced starvation, John helped us obtain food and supplies. He did this secretly, risking punishment from his own people. Red Hawk picked up the story. When cattle rustlers tried to frame our people for stealing livestock, John helped us prove our innocence and track down the real thieves. He has stood with us in times of trouble, asking nothing in return. But more than that, Stone Bear added, his deep voice filling the small office. John has shown respect for our ways, our beliefs, our people. He has proven that white men and Apache can live in peace if both sides choose honor over hatred. The sheriff and Sarah looked at John with new understanding. This quiet cowboy who had drifted into their town was far more than he had appeared to be. He was a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for generations. So when John called for help, Morning Star concluded, Chief Gray Wolf called in debts from the other clans. 77 warriors answered, not because they love white people, but because they love John. A comfortable silence fell over the room as everyone absorbed this information. Finally, Crawford spoke. What do we tell the townspeople? Some of them are going to be nervous about having that many Apache warriors in the area, even if they're here to help. Tell them the truth, John said simply. Tell them that help is coming, and that they need to trust in something bigger than their fears. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses thundered down the main street. Everyone rushed to the window to see a sight that made their blood run cold. Marcus Garrett and at least 30 heavily armed riders had just entered Copper Creek. But something was different this time. Instead of the swagger and bravado Garrett had shown during his previous visit, there was a grim determination in his manner. His men spread out along the street with military precision, taking positions that suggested they were here for more than intimidation. He's not waiting, Crawford muttered. He's attacking now. Through the window, they could see Garrett surveying the town with the eye of a general studying a battlefield. His gaze stopped on the sheriff's office, and, even from a distance, his cold smile was visible. John, Garrett's voice carried clearly across the street. I know you're in there. Come out, and face me like a man. Stone Bear moved toward the door, but John stopped him with a gesture. Not yet. Let's see what he wants. He wants you dead, Morning Star said flatly, and he wants this town to know what happens to people who oppose him. John checked his pistol and moved toward the door. Then, let's not keep him waiting. John, wait, Sarah called. There are too many of them. This isn't like yesterday. No, John agreed, his hand on the door handle. It's not. But Garrett made one mistake. He came back too soon. Before anyone could ask what he meant, John stepped out onto the street to face the gang that had come to destroy Copper Creek. Behind him, 3 Apache warriors followed, their presence sending a ripple of surprise through Garrett's men. What none of the outlaws knew was that their early arrival had been observed by scouts who moved like shadows through the desert. Even now, messages were being sent by mirror flash and smoke signal to 77 warriors who were already closer to Copper Creek than anyone imagined. The battle for the soul of Copper Creek was about to begin, but Marcus Garrett had no idea that he was walking into a trap that had been set by forces beyond his understanding. The quiet cowboy he had dismissed as weak was backed by a brotherhood of warriors whose loyalty ran deeper than blood, and whose fighting skills had been honed by generations of survival in the harshest land on earth. As John stepped into the street to face his enemy, the Apache drums that had been silent for generations began to beat once again in the hidden places of the desert. The sound carried a message that made the earth itself seem to tremble. The eagle, bear, and wolf clans were riding to war. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street of Copper Creek as John emerged from the sheriff's office to face Marcus Garrett and his expanded gang. The outlaw leader sat his horse with the confidence of a man who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with bullets and intimidation. His cold blue eyes swept over John and the 3 Apache warriors behind him, and his scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. Well, Garrett called out, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. Looks like our tame cowboy has made some interesting friends. Planning a little war party, are we? John stepped into the street, his movements calm and measured despite being outnumbered 10-1. Red Hawk, Stone Bear, and Morning Star spread out behind him, their positions carefully chosen to provide mutual support while giving them clear fields of fire. I warned you to move on, Garrett, John said quietly. You should have listened. Garrett laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made several townspeople flinch. You warned me? Boy, I got 30 guns backing me up, and you've got 3 redskins and a badge-wearing old man. What exactly do you think you're going to do? What needs to be done, John replied. The outlaw leader's expression darkened. I'm going to give you one chance, stranger. You and your Apache friends mount up and ride out of here right now, and I might let you live. Stay, and I guarantee you'll be feeding the buzzards by sundown. Morning Star stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of generations of Apache warriors. You threaten innocent people. Among our people, this makes you less than nothing. Lady, I don't know what fairy tales this cowboy's been telling you about white and Apache friendship, Garrett sneered, but the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And you're about to find out how right that saying is. The words had barely left Garrett's mouth when Stone Bear moved with lightning speed, his rifle appearing in his hands as if by magic. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed off the buildings as one of Garrett's men, who had been reaching for his weapon, tumbled from his saddle with a bullet in his shoulder. The next man who moves dies, Stone Bear announced calmly, his rifle already tracking toward another target. Garrett's face flushed with rage, but he was experienced enough to recognize the deadly competence of the Apache warriors. You just signed a death warrant, all of you. Maybe, John said, but you won't be around to see it. What happened next became legend in Copper Creek and the surrounding territory for generations to come. Garrett went for his gun with all the speed and skill that had made him the most feared outlaw in 3 territories. His hand was a blur as it swept toward his holster, and several of his men began their own draws in support. But John was ready. His pistol appeared in his hand with the fluid grace of a man who had spent years perfecting his craft, and the street exploded into chaos as gunfire erupted from multiple positions. John's first shot took Garrett in the gun hand, spinning the outlaw leader around in his saddle as his weapon flew into the dust. Red Hawk's rifle boomed, and another outlaw pitched backward off his horse. Morningstar, using a traditional Apache war bow with deadly accuracy, sent an arrow through the arm of a man trying to flank them from the left. The townspeople of Copper Creek had been expecting a massacre, but they were witnessing something entirely different. Despite being outnumbered, John and his Apache allies were fighting with a coordination and skill that spoke of long partnership in desperate situations. Get down, Sheriff Crawford shouted to the civilians who were still visible as bullets began flying in earnest. The gang members, shocked by the effectiveness of their opponent's first volley, were fighting back with the desperate fury of men who had suddenly realized they might not survive the day. Doc Morrison had set up a makeshift medical station in his office and was already treating the first wounded man when Sarah Mitchell burst through his door, carrying a rifle and a determined expression that would have surprised anyone who thought of her as just a shopkeeper's daughter. "Doc, you need to know something," she said, checking her rifle's load with practiced efficiency. "Before all this started, I saw signal mirrors flashing from the hills north of town. If John's Apache friends have more warriors out there." Her words were interrupted by a sound that made everyone freeze, the distant thunder of many horses approaching fast. Through the dust and gun smoke, riders became visible on the horizon, approaching Copper Creek from 3 different directions. But these weren't more outlaws coming to Garrett's aid. These were Apache warriors, 77 of the finest fighters the desert had ever produced, riding to honor an old debt and protect a brother who had proven himself worthy of their loyalty. Chief Gray Wolf himself led the Eagle Clan warriors from the north, his war paint and eagle feathers marking him as a leader whose reputation was known throughout the territory. From the east came the Bear Clan, led by a massive warrior called Mountain Walker, whose very presence on the battlefield was said to strike fear into enemies. And from the west rode the Wolf Clan, silent as shadows and twice as deadly. Marcus Garrett, still clutching his wounded hand, stared in horror at the approaching forces. His gang of 30 men suddenly seemed pitifully small against the tide of Apache warriors flowing toward them like a force of nature. "This isn't possible," one of his men whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of approaching hoofbeats. "Apache don't help white folks," another gang member said, but his voice carried no conviction. The evidence of his eyes was overwhelming. Chief Gray Wolf rode straight toward the center of town, his horse moving with the fluid grace of a natural partnership between man and animal. When he reached the main street, he raised his war lance and called out in a voice that seemed to shake the very buildings. "Marcus Garrett, you who threaten the innocent and make war on the helpless, face the consequences of your actions." The outlaw leader tried to rally his men, but the sight of so many Apache warriors had shattered their morale. Several gang members were already spurring their horses toward the edge of town, choosing flight over a battle they couldn't possibly win. "Stand and fight, ye yellow dogs." Garrett screamed at his fleeing men, but his words fell on deaf ears. When faced with certain death, even the most hardened outlaws chose survival over loyalty. John stepped forward, his gun trained on Garrett. It's over. Surrender, and you'll get a fair trial. Never, Garrett snarled, reaching for a hidden knife with his good hand. If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. But before Garrett could complete his desperate attack, Morningstar's bow sang again. The arrow took the outlaw leader in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground in the dust of the main street. The Battle of Copper Creek, as it would later be known, lasted less than 20 minutes from first shot to final surrender. Of Garrett's original force of 30 men, 8 were dead, 15 were wounded, and the rest had fled into the desert where Apache scouts would track them down over the following days. As the dust settled and the gun smoke cleared, the people of Copper Creek emerged from their hiding places to witness a sight that would be remembered for generations. In the middle of their main street, white settlers and Apache warriors stood side by side, having fought together against a common enemy. Chief Gray Wolf dismounted and walked to where John stood over the wounded Garrett. The chief was an impressive figure, tall and weathered by decades of desert warfare, his dark eyes holding the wisdom and strength that had made him a leader of his people. "Brother," the chief said in English, clasping John's shoulder. "It is good to see you well." "And you, my friend," John replied in the Apache tongue. "Thank you for coming." "We came not just for you," Chief Gray Wolf said, looking around at the townspeople who were cautiously approaching. "We came because what you told us about these people proved to be true. They're worth protecting." Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, removing his hat in respect. "Chief, I don't know how to thank you and your warriors. You saved our town, maybe our lives." Chief Gray Wolf studied the sheriff for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. "You are the one who protects this place?" "I try to," Crawford replied honestly. "Then, we understand each other," the chief said. "Both our peoples value those who stand between the innocent and those who would harm them." Sarah Mitchell approached Morningstar, who was retrieving her arrows from the fallen outlaws. "I wanted to thank you personally," Sarah said. "What you did today, it changes everything." Morningstar looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean that nobody in this territory will ever be able to say again that Apache and white people can't work together," Sarah explained. "You've proven that when good people stand together, they can overcome any evil." As the wounded were tended to and the dead were removed, the people of Copper Creek began to realize the magnitude of what had just occurred. Not only had they been saved from Marcus Garrett's gang, but they had witnessed the birth of something new in the frontier, a genuine alliance between Apache and white settlers based on mutual respect and shared values. Doc Morrison, who had been treating wounded men from both sides with equal care, approached John with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "this isn't just about one battle, is it? This is about showing people that there's another way to live in this territory." John nodded, watching as Apache warriors and white townspeople began the careful process of getting to know each other as individuals rather than enemies. People have been taught to fear and hate each other for so long. They've forgotten that we all want the same basic things: safety for our families, respect for our way of life, and the chance to live in peace. Chief Gray Wolf approached, having finished organizing his warriors for the journey back to their hidden camps. "John, my friend, this day has been good. The enemy is defeated, and no innocent blood was spilled. What happens now?" John asked. "Now we return to our people and tell them what we have seen," the chief replied. "We will tell them that in the town called Copper Creek, there are white people who understand honor. Perhaps it is possible that our peoples can share this land in peace. And if there's trouble again?" Chief Gray Wolf smiled, and for a moment, the stern war leader looked almost grandfatherly. "Then, you know how to call us, brother. The Apache have long memories, especially for those who prove themselves friends." As the Apache warriors prepared to depart, taking with them several captured gang members who would be turned over to the territorial marshal, the people of Copper Creek gathered to watch. The sight of the mounted warriors, their weapons gleaming in the late afternoon sun, would remain etched in memory long after the last hoofbeat had faded into the distance. But it was not an ending the townspeople were witnessing. It was a beginning. The events of that day had shown that the barriers between peoples could be overcome when honor and courage demanded it. The quiet cowboy who had drifted into their town had revealed connections and loyalties that spanned the cultural divide, proving that friendship and respect could bridge any gap. As John watched his Apache brothers ride away, he knew that his own life had been forever changed as well. He had come to Copper Creek as a drifter with no particular destination in mind. Now he found himself at the center of something much larger than himself. A living example that the frontier could be a place where different peoples worked together rather than fought each other. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, when Sarah Mitchell approached John on the steps of the sheriff's office. The town was quiet now, the excitement of the day giving way to the peaceful exhaustion that follows great events. "Will you stay?" she asked simply. John looked down the main street of Copper Creek, seeing it not as the frightened settlement he had found a few days earlier, but as a community that had proven itself worthy of protection and respect. "I think I will," he said. "This feels like home." Behind them, Sheriff Crawford emerged from his office, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Well then," he said, "I reckon Copper Creek just got itself a new deputy. That is, if you're interested in the job." John looked at the badge Crawford was holding out to him, then at the faces of the people who had become his neighbors and friends. In accepting that badge, he would be accepting something more. The responsibility to protect what they had built together and to ensure that the alliance forged in battle could grow into something lasting and beautiful. "I'm interested," John said, pinning the badge to his vest. "Very interested." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the people of Copper Creek settled into their homes with a sense of security they had never known before. They slept peacefully, knowing that their town was protected not only by good men with badges and guns, but by alliances that reached beyond the boundaries of race and culture. In the high places of the desert, Apache signal fires carried the news of the day's victory to the farthest reaches of the territory. The message was simple but profound. The time of endless warfare might be ending, and a new era of peace might be beginning. But even as the people of Copper Creek celebrated their victory and looked toward a hopeful future, shadows were gathering in distant places. Marcus Garrett had been captured, but his defeat would not go unnoticed by other outlaw leaders. The alliance between John and the Apache had created something unprecedented, but it had also created new enemies who would see such cooperation as a threat to their way of life. The real test of what they had built together was yet to come. 6 months had passed since the Battle of Copper Creek, and the small frontier town had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible before John's arrival. What had once been a frightened settlement cowering before outlaw threats had become a thriving community that served as a beacon of hope throughout the territory. John adjusted his deputy's badge as he walked down the main street on a crisp morning in early spring. The town had grown significantly, with new families arriving weekly, drawn by reports of a place where people could live in peace regardless of their background. The main street now boasted 2 general stores, a proper hotel, and even a schoolhouse where children from both white and Apache families learned together. "Morning, John," called out Pete Donnelly from the Lucky Dollar Saloon, which had been transformed from a rough drinking establishment into a respectable establishment that served the growing community. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "Thanks, Pete," John replied, accepting the steaming cup gratefully. "Any word from the territorial capital?" Pete's expression grew serious. "The marshal's supposed to arrive this afternoon with that government official from Washington. Word is they want to see for themselves what's been happening here." John nodded, though inwardly he felt the familiar tension that came with official attention. The alliance between Copper Creek and the Apache clans had attracted notice from territorial authorities, some of whom viewed the arrangement with suspicion. There had been reports of officials who believed that any cooperation with Apache peoples was dangerous, regardless of the positive results. "John," the voice belonged to Tommy Peterson, now 13 and serving as an unofficial messenger for the town. "Chief Gray Wolf is here with Morningstar. They're waiting at the sheriff's office." John finished his coffee quickly and made his way to the sheriff's office, where he found Chief Gray Wolf and his daughter deep in conversation with Sheriff Crawford. The Apache leader had aged visibly in the past months, the weight of negotiating between 2 worlds taking its toll, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him a legendary leader. "My friend," Chief Gray Wolf said, rising to clasp John's hand. "We need to speak privately." The urgency in the chief's voice concerned John. "What's happened?" Morningstar answered, her expression grim. "Runners from the Eastern Territories bring word of a new threat. Colonel Harrison Pike and the 7th Cavalry have been ordered to this territory. Pike believes that any cooperation between white and Apache peoples is a sign of weakness that must be eliminated." John felt his blood run cold. Colonel Pike was notorious throughout the frontier for his brutal approach to Indian relations. Unlike the territorial marshal and other officials who might be reasoned with, Pike saw Apache people as enemies to be destroyed regardless of circumstances. "How long do we have?" Sheriff Crawford asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3, Chief Gray Wolf replied. "Pike is bringing 300 soldiers and has requisitioned additional cavalry from Fort Preston. He has orders to restore proper order to this territory." John sat down heavily, his mind racing through possibilities. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means," Morningstar said quietly, "that he intends to destroy everything we've built here. He will brand the Apache as hostile, the townspeople as collaborators, and you as a traitor to your own race." The weight of the situation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Everything they had accomplished, all the bridges they had built between peoples, all the hope they had created for a different kind of future, was threatened by a man who saw the world only in terms of conquest and domination. "We could fight," Sheriff Crawford said, though his voice lacked conviction. "With what?" John asked. "Pike has professional soldiers, artillery, supply lines. Even with all our Apache allies, we couldn't stand against that kind of force in open battle." Chief Gray Wolf leaned forward, his weathered hands folded on the desk. "There's another way, but it requires great courage from all of us." "What way?" John asked. "We must prove to Pike and to the government officials who come with him that what we have built here is not dangerous but beneficial. We must show them that cooperation between peoples creates strength, not weakness." Morningstar nodded. "The territorial marshal arriving today is not our enemy. Neither is the Washington official. They come to investigate, not to destroy. If we can convince them that Copper Creek represents a better future for the territory, they might have the influence to stop Pike." Over the following hours, the leadership of both communities worked frantically to prepare for what might be their only chance to save everything they had built together. Sarah Mitchell organized the townspeople to prepare a demonstration of their community's prosperity. Doc Morrison gathered statistics showing how violence and crime had virtually disappeared from their area since the alliance began. Even Red Hawkins, who had initially opposed the Apache alliance, but had since become one of its strongest supporters, worked to coordinate testimonials from grateful ranchers whose property had been protected by Apache scouts. When the territorial marshal arrived that afternoon, accompanied by a stern-faced man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Assistant Secretary of Interior Affairs William Thornton, they found Copper Creek buzzing with purposeful activity. "This is quite different from what I expected," Marshal Davies commented as he observed Apache and white children playing together in the schoolyard while their parents conducted business with easy familiarity. "Different how?" John asked, falling into step beside the marshal as they toured the town. "The reports we've been receiving suggested a dangerous situation where white settlers were being manipulated by hostile Indians," Davies replied honestly. "What I'm seeing here looks more like, well, like a community." Assistant Secretary Thornton was more skeptical. "Deputy, I've been sent here specifically because of concerns raised by military commanders about the security implications of your arrangement with Apache peoples. How do you respond to charges that you're compromising the safety of white settlers by treating hostile Indians as allies?" John stopped walking and turned to face the official directly. "Mr. Thornton, with respect, I think you need to understand what hostile actually means in this context." He gestured toward a group of Apache warriors who were helping white ranchers repair a barn that had been damaged in a recent storm. "Those men have put their lives on the line to protect this community. They've tracked down cattle rustlers, rescued lost travelers, and stood guard during dangerous situations. If that's hostility, then I'll take hostile allies over peaceful enemies any day. But what about the larger implications?" Thornton pressed. "If every frontier settlement starts making private treaties with Indian tribes, we lose all federal control over Indian affairs." "Mr. Thornton," Sheriff Crawford interjected, "let me ask you something. How many territorial officials have died in Apache raids in this area in the past 6 months?" I'm not sure." "None," Crawford replied firmly. "How many white settlers have been killed or injured by Apache in this region during that time?" "I don't have those figures." "Also none," Crawford continued. "How many Apache have been killed by white settlers in our territory in the past 6 months?" "Again, I don't." "None," Sheriff Crawford finished. "Now, how does that compare to other areas where the government's traditional policies are in effect?" Assistant Secretary Thornton's silence was answer enough. Everyone knew that frontier violence between whites and Apache was endemic throughout most of the territory. That evening, Chief Gray Wolf invited the officials to attend a council meeting where representatives of all three Apache clans would speak about the alliance. The gathering took place in a natural amphitheater just outside town, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on the red rock walls. The ceremony began with traditional Apache prayers and songs, but Chief Gray Wolf quickly moved to the heart of the matter. "My white friends," he said, addressing Davies and Thornton directly, "you have come to understand what we have built here. Let me tell you why we built it." He gestured to an elderly Apache man who rose slowly, leaning heavily on a walking stick. "This is Grandfather Wind Speaker, oldest member of the Eagle clan. He has seen 87 winters and remembers when the first white settlers came to our lands." Wind Speaker's voice was thin with age, but carried easily in the still evening air. "I have seen much war, much death, much sorrow between our peoples. I have lost sons to white bullets, grandsons to white diseases, granddaughters to white soldiers who showed no honor." His ancient eyes found those of Assistant Secretary Thornton. "But I have also lived to see something I thought impossible. A place where the children of my enemies play with the children of my people, where warriors of different colors stand together against common dangers, where the earth is not soaked with blood but blessed with peace." Wind Speaker paused, gathering his strength. "You ask why we make alliance with these white people. I ask you, why would we not? They have shown us respect, kept their promises, shared their strength. Is this not better than war?" When Wind Speaker sat down, Morningstar rose to address the officials. "Assistant Secretary Thornton, you speak of federal control over Indian affairs. But what has that control brought our people? Broken treaties, stolen lands, children taken from their families to be educated in distant schools where they are forbidden to speak our language or practice our beliefs." Her voice carried the passion of a woman who had seen too much injustice. "Here in Copper Creek, our children learn alongside white children, but they also learn Apache ways from Apache elders. Here, our warriors are respected as men of honor rather than hunted as animals. Here, our women can walk safely because white men and Apache men protect them together." Marshal Davies leaned forward. "But what about federal law? What about the reservations established by treaty?" Chief Gray Wolf stood, his presence commanding attention. "Marshal, show me the treaty that forbids Apache people from living in peace with white neighbors. Show me the law that makes it illegal for warriors to protect innocent people regardless of their color. Show me the regulation that prohibits children of different races from playing together." Davies was silent, recognizing the logical trap the chief had laid for him. "There are no such laws," Chief Gray Wolf continued, "because what we have done here breaks no federal statute. We have not made treaties that conflict with Washington's authority. We have not claimed lands that belong to others. We have not armed ourselves against the United States government. We have simply chosen cooperation over conflict, friendship over enmity, peace over war." The council continued late into the night, with speakers from all parts of the community sharing their experiences. Frank Taylor spoke about how Apache scouts had warned him of flash floods that would have destroyed his ranch. Doc Morrison described how Apache medicine men had helped him treat diseases he had never encountered before. Sarah Mitchell told of Apache women who had taught her techniques for preserving food that had saved her family during a harsh winter. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when young Tommy Peterson stood up, barely visible in the torchlight, and addressed the federal officials with the earnest conviction that only children possess. "Mr. Thornton, sir," Tommy said, his voice carrying despite his youth, "my best friend is Little Eagle, and he's Apache. When my pa got hurt last month and couldn't work our farm, Little Eagle's family came and helped us bring in our crop. They didn't ask for nothing in return. They just did it because it was the right thing to do." The boy paused, looking directly at the assistant secretary. "Now, you tell me, sir, what's wrong with people helping each other? What's wrong with friends being friends? And why would any government want to stop that?" The silence that followed Tommy's words was profound. Even Assistant Secretary Thornton seemed moved by the child's simple eloquence. When the council ended and the officials retired to their rooms at the hotel, John found himself walking the quiet streets of Copper Creek with Morningstar. The town was peaceful under the starlight, a testament to what could be accomplished when people chose understanding over fear. "Do you think we convinced them?" Morningstar asked. "Thornton's still skeptical, but Davy seems to understand what we're doing here. John replied. The real question is whether they can stop Colonel Pike. And if they can't? John was quiet for a long moment. Then, we'll face whatever comes together, just like we've faced everything else. The next morning brought news that would test that resolve. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of Colonel Harrison Pike and his cavalry, 3 days earlier than expected. The sound of marching boots and jingling equipment filled the air as 300 soldiers established a camp on the outskirts of town. Pike himself was an imposing figure, tall and rigid with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. His uniform was immaculate, his gray mustache perfectly groomed, and his pale blue eyes held the cold certainty of someone who saw the world in stark terms of right and wrong. The colonel's first act was to demand a meeting with all civil and military authorities in the territory. This included Marshal Davies, Assistant Secretary Thornton, Sheriff Crawford, and, to John's surprise, himself. Gentlemen, Pike began without preamble as they gathered in the hotel's largest room. I have been sent here to restore proper order to a territory that has clearly lost its way. Reports of civilian authorities collaborating with hostile Indians are extremely troubling to the War Department. Colonel, Marshal Davies interjected, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the situation here. Pike's cold gaze fixed on the Marshal. There is no misunderstanding. This settlement has entered into unauthorized agreements with Apache savages, compromising the security of white settlers throughout the territory. Such arrangements are not only illegal, but dangerous to the extreme. Assistant Secretary Thornton spoke up. Colonel, I've spent the last 2 days investigating the situation here, and I must say that the results of this cooperation have been remarkable. Crime is virtually non-existent. Economic prosperity is increasing, and there have been no hostile incidents. Mr. Thornton, Pike replied icily, I'm afraid your civilian perspective prevents you from seeing the military implications. By treating Apache as equals, this community has emboldened hostile tribes throughout the region. Other Apache bands now believe they can negotiate with white settlements rather than submitting to proper federal authority. John had remained silent during this exchange, but now he felt compelled to speak. Colonel, with respect, the Apache people we've allied with have prevented more violence than they've caused. They've protected travelers, tracked down actual criminals, and... Deputy, Pike interrupted. You are relieved of duty as of this moment. Your collaboration with hostile Indians makes you unfit to carry a federal commission. The words hit John like a physical blow. But before he could respond, Sheriff Crawford stood up. Colonel, John was appointed by local authority, not federal. You don't have the power to relieve him. Pike's face flushed with anger. Sheriff Crawford, you have 48 hours to sever all relationships with Apache tribes and remove all Indian presence from his settlement. Failure to comply will result in federal intervention. And what exactly does federal intervention mean? Davies asked quietly. It means, Pike replied, his voice deadly calm, that I will treat any Apache found within 20 miles of this settlement as hostile combatants. It means that any white civilians who resist will be considered to be in armed rebellion against federal authority. And it means that this territory will be restored to proper order regardless of the cost. The threat was unmistakable. Pike was prepared to start a war to destroy what Copper Creek had built. That afternoon, emergency meetings were held throughout the town as word of Pike's ultimatum spread. The Apache leaders, who had been camping nearby to attend the federal investigation, gathered to discuss their response to what amounted to a declaration of war. We could fight, Stone Bear said grimly. Our warriors are skilled, and we know this land better than any soldier. Fighting would destroy everything we've accomplished, John argued. Pike wants us to resist so he can justify using force. If we give him that justification, he'll massacre everyone, Apache and white alike. Chief Gray Wolf, who had been silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke. There is perhaps one other choice. What choice? Morningstar asked. We could leave, the old chief said quietly. Return to the deep canyons, hide in the secret places, and wait for this storm to pass. The suggestion hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone knew that if the Apache left Copper Creek, they would probably never return. The community they had built together would be destroyed, and the chance for a different kind of future would be lost forever. No, Sarah Mitchell said firmly. She had been invited to the meeting as one of the town's leaders, and now she spoke with a conviction that surprised everyone. No, we won't let fear drive us apart. Sarah, Crawford said gently. Pike has 300 soldiers. If we resist— I'm not talking about armed resistance, Sarah interrupted. I'm talking about moral resistance. I'm talking about showing Pike and the whole territory what they'll be destroying. She looked around the circle of faces, Apache and white alike. Tomorrow is Sunday. What if we held a service? Not just any service, but one that shows exactly what we've built here. Let Pike see Apache and white families worshiping together. Let him see our children playing together. Let him see what peace actually looks like. You think that will change his mind? Red Hawk asked skeptically. Maybe not his, Sarah replied, but it might change the minds of his soldiers. They're not all monsters. Some of them might realize that they're being asked to destroy something beautiful rather than defeat something dangerous. Jean felt a spark of hope. It could work, if enough of Pike's men refused to follow his orders. It's worth trying, Chief Grey Wolf agreed. Better to make our stand for what we believe than to run or fight and lose everything anyway. Word spread quickly through both communities about the planned service. As Sunday morning dawned, people from throughout the region began arriving in Copper Creek. White settlers came from distant ranches, Apache families emerged from hidden camps, and even some of Pike's own soldiers began drifting toward the town, curious about what they would see. The service was held in the natural amphitheater where the council meeting had taken place. As people gathered, Pike arrived with a full company of soldiers, clearly intending to use the gathering as evidence of the dangerous conspiracy he claimed to be fighting. But what the colonel saw defied all his expectations. Instead of a war council or political rally, he witnessed something that challenged every assumption he had made about the frontier. Apache elders sat next to white ranchers, sharing stories and laughter. Children of both cultures played together with the easy friendship that only the young can manage. Women from different backgrounds compared recipes and child-rearing techniques. Warriors and cowboys discussed hunting techniques and weather patterns with the mutual respect of professionals. The actual service was led jointly by Doc Morrison, who sometimes preached for the community, and an Apache holy man named Wise Crow. The prayers were offered in both languages. The songs combined traditional hymns with Apache chants, and the message was one of universal brotherhood and the importance of protecting all of God's children. As the service continued, John noticed something remarkable happening among Pike's soldiers. Many of them had initially stood at rigid attention, ready to follow their colonel's orders without question. But as they watched the peaceful gathering, their posture began to change. Some removed their hats out of respect for the religious ceremony. Others began talking quietly among themselves, their expressions showing confusion and doubt rather than the certainty Pike demanded. When the service ended, people didn't immediately disperse. Instead, they lingered, Apache and white families sharing food and conversation in a natural display of the community they had created together. Colonel Pike's face was a mask of barely controlled rage as he watched his certainties crumble before his eyes. This wasn't the savage conspiracy he had expected to find. These weren't hostile Indians plotting against white settlers. This was something far more dangerous to his worldview, proof that his beliefs about racial superiority and the necessity of violence were wrong. Colonel, Assistant Secretary Thornton said quietly, approaching Pike as he stood rigidly watching the gathering. I think we need to reconsider our approach here. Reconsider? Pike's voice was strangled with fury. Mr. Thornton, you're being deceived by a carefully orchestrated display. These savages are manipulating you, using your natural compassion against you. Are they? Thornton replied, gesturing toward a group where Apache children were teaching white children a traditional game while their parents watched with amusement. Because what I see here looks remarkably like the American values we're supposed to be defending: tolerance, cooperation, mutual respect, and the pursuit of happiness. Pike turned his cold glare on the assistant secretary. Mr. Thornton, I have my orders. And I have mine, Thornton replied firmly. The president sent me here to investigate and report on the situation in this territory. What I'm going to report is that Copper Creek represents the most successful example of peaceful Indian relations I've ever witnessed. I'm going to recommend that instead of destroying what's been built here, we should be studying it and replicating it throughout the frontier. The confrontation between the two federal officials was interrupted by an unexpected development. A young cavalry sergeant approached Pike, his face pale but determined. Colonel, sir, I need to speak with you. What is it, Sergeant Williams? Sir, it's about the men. Some of them are asking questions about our mission here. They're wondering if, well, sir, if we're on the right side of the situation. Pike's face went white with rage. Sergeant, you will order the men to prepare for operations against the hostile Indian encampment. Anyone who questions orders will be subject to court-martial. Sir, William said quietly, I don't think the men will follow those orders. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. For the first time in his military career, Colonel Pike was facing the possibility that his own soldiers would refuse to obey him. What did you say, Sergeant? Williams straightened his shoulders, making a decision that would define the rest of his life. Sir, I said the men won't follow orders to attack peaceful civilians. We didn't sign up to make war on families and children. Around them, other soldiers began nodding their agreement. Pike's absolute authority, built on years of unquestioned obedience, was crumbling as his men saw for themselves that his version of reality didn't match what they were witnessing. In that moment, John understood that the battle for Copper Creek had been won not through violence, but through the simple power of truth. Pike could order attacks and threaten courts-martial, but he couldn't force men to unsee what they had seen or unknow what they had learned. Colonel Pike, Marshal Davies said formally, stepping forward, I'm ordering you to stand down. As the senior federal law enforcement official in this territory, I'm declaring that there is no hostile Indian threat here and no justification for military action. Pike's hand moved to his sidearm, and for a moment, John thought the colonel might actually draw his weapon against a federal marshal. But even Pike wasn't willing to go that far. Instead, he turned and stalked away, shouting orders that fewer and fewer of his men seemed inclined to follow. Over the following days, Pike's command disintegrated as soldiers individually and in groups refused to participate in what they increasingly saw as an unjust mission. Some requested transfers. Others simply deserted. Within a week, the colonel found himself with fewer than 50 men willing to follow his orders, and those were mostly officers whose careers depended on maintaining military discipline regardless of moral considerations. Assistant Secretary Thornton's report to Washington was everything John and the others had hoped for. In clear, detailed language, he described Copper Creek as a model for peaceful frontier development and recommended that federal policy be revised to support rather than hinder such cooperative arrangements. The territorial legislature, influenced by Thornton's report and the visible success of the Copper Creek Alliance, passed a resolution formally recognizing the right of local communities to enter into peaceful agreements with Native American tribes, provided such agreements didn't conflict with federal law. But perhaps the most significant victory was less official, but more lasting. Word of what had happened at Copper Creek spread throughout the territory and beyond. Other communities began reaching out to local Apache bands, seeking to establish their own cooperative relationships. The idea that white and Apache peoples could live together in mutual respect and shared prosperity began to take root in places that had known only conflict and fear. 6 months later, as John sat on the porch of his small house on the outskirts of Copper Creek, watching Sarah Mitchell tend the garden they had planted together, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He wore his deputy's badge with pride, knowing that it represented not just law enforcement authority, but a commitment to protecting the community that had grown beyond anyone's imagination. The town had continued to prosper, becoming a regional center for trade and education that attracted visitors from across the frontier. The school now had over 60 students, Apache and white children learning together in a classroom that had become a symbol of possibility. The economy thrived as Apache knowledge of the land combined with white farming and business techniques to create prosperity for everyone. Chief Gray Wolf, despite his advancing years, had become an informal advisor to the territorial government, helping to draft policies that respected both Apache traditions and the needs of white settlers. Morningstar had married a young cavalry officer named David Harrison, who had been one of the first soldiers to refuse Pike's orders, and their wedding had been celebrated by both communities as a symbol of the new future they were building together. Thinking deep thoughts, Sarah asked, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Just remembering, John replied, accepting the coffee gratefully, remembering how all this started with one confrontation on a dusty street. And now look at us, Sarah said, settling beside him. Who would have thought that standing up to a bully would lead to all this? John smiled, thinking of the quiet cowboy who had ridden into Copper Creek so long ago, carrying secrets about alliances that most people couldn't have imagined. Sometimes, he said, the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with the courage to see people as they really are instead of as we've been taught to fear them. In the distance, the sound of children's laughter carried on the evening breeze, Apache and white voices joining together in the universal language of play. It was a sound that spoke of hope, of possibility, and of a future where the color of a person's skin mattered less than the content of their character. The story of Copper Creek had become legend throughout the territory, told and retold in saloons and around campfires as an example of what was possible when good people chose courage over fear and cooperation over conflict. But for John, Sarah, and the families who called the town home, it was something simpler and more profound. It was proof that the American dream of freedom and equality could be extended to everyone, regardless of race or background, when people had the courage to make it reality. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, John thought about the Apache, saying that Chief Gray Wolf had taught him years ago, "We are all related." In Copper Creek, that saying had become more than just words. It had become a way of life that had transformed a frightened frontier settlement into a beacon of hope for the entire American West. The quiet cowboy who had once been dismissed as weak had proven that true strength came not from the number of guns at your side, but from a number of people willing to stand beside you when principle demanded it. And the Apache warriors who had answered his call had shown that honor and loyalty transcended all boundaries of race and culture. Together, they had created something beautiful, something lasting, and something that would inspire generations to come. They had proven that in America, anyone could find family among those brave enough to see beyond differences to the common humanity that connected them all.